Hello, and thanks for watching my presentation, Practicing with Pen and Paper, Incorporating Score Study into the Studio at the Unexpected MTNA 2020 Virtual Conference. My name is Brendan Jacklin, and today we'll be exploring how to score study, including why it is a good idea and how you might practically use it for yourself, your studio, and for students of all different skill levels. So I wanted to look into score study because frankly, I do not do nearly as much of it as I should, and this seemed like a really good way to force myself into incorporating it into my own practice. If I could convince myself to score study, this presentation at least seemed worth the effort. So originally, this is where I had planned to ask a number of pseudo embarrassing questions to my audience, and you guys would raise your hands, and then we would go from there. Questions would be like, "Who here thinks score studying is important?" And then I imagine everyone would raise their hand. And then I would ask, "Who score studies every day?" And I imagine a lot less of you would raise your hand. Every week, we might get a few more hands raised. Who gets their students to score study regularly? And then who actually checks to see if your students follow through on score studying? So ask yourself these questions now. I imagine that as you do, there are probably many more of you that think score studying is important and valuable than those that actually regularly do it for themselves or in their studio. So, pretending that this totally now made up scenario is correct, we're going to sort of try and figure out how we can fix that gap. The first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what is score studying? So for this presentation, and to accommodate as many different studios and scenarios as I could think of, I've adopted a rather wide definition. So essentially, score studying is going to be any learning that you can do away from the instrument. Conductor Pascal Verreau suggests that score study is anything that brings you closer to understanding the why of music. And similarly, Dr. Glenn Price suggests it is anything that leads you towards a greater understanding of the composer's intention. This includes everything from oral and visual study of the score to any type of theoretical analysis to any type of learning about the history of both the piece and the composer. Now, score studying is not a new idea. Indeed, music students throughout the ages have had to do score studying. Students before the printing press, before scores were widely available, had to copy scores by hand in order to understand both counterpoint and how to compose their own music. So that is a form of score studying right there. In his Rules for Young Musicians from 1848, composer Robert Schumann mentions score studying several times, and I've highlighted a couple of those here. So the first one, you must not only be able to play your little pieces with the fingers, you must be able to hum them over without a piano. Sharpen your imagination so that you may fix in your mind not only the melody of a composition, but also the harmony belonging to it. And then another one was, accustom yourself, even though you have but little voice, to sing at sight without the aid of an instrument. You must carry it so far that you can understand a piece of music upon paper. So I particularly like this last quotation, as I am one of those people with but little voice. And I think it's important for both teachers and students to understand that audiating and singing scores does not require a professionally trained voice. You can get a lot of benefit from it just with what you have. And of course, we probably have all heard stories of incredible tales of musicians learning complete scores away from the instrument. Arthur Rubinstein famously boasted about hardly practicing while young. He wrote of summers hanging out and drinking with Paderewski. Franz Liszt could grasp a composition so completely at sight that he was world renowned sight reader. He didn't need to practice. He did, but he didn't need to. And then even today, so musicians such as Helen Grimaud regularly accomplish such feats. Her partner, Matt Hennick, was describing a conversation over coffee while they were traveling for some of her performances. And he said, I said to Helen, you have a concert coming. Did you practice? And she said, I played the piece 2 times in my head. And for her, somehow that was enough. So, luckily for us normal people, we do not need to reach such a high level to see such benefits from score studying. Any increase in our musical understanding is well worth the effort, and we should start it as soon as we begin our musical studies. In my own personal experience, I find that beginning method books are really terrific at including score studying activities. You can find everything from finding rhythmic patterns, clapping, counting, identifying new notes, terms, and articulations, identifying tonic and dominant chords, through all sorts of different types of games, all happen in the first levels of many method books. And you get activities like coloring, word searches, matching, copying notes, composition, and more. But somewhere along the way, it just sort of stops. And students, by and large, do not engage with their music in the same way. And so this presentation is largely sort of to try and fix that gap. To do so, I have broken down different score studying ideas into 5 broad categories. So we have theoretical, thematic, historical, narrative, and memory. Now, there's obvious overlap between these, and as we go through different ideas, it's important to keep in mind that not every approach will work for every teacher or every student. The trick is to experiment and find whatever ideas work well for your situation. Our first category is theoretical, and this is the one that people often think of when they think of score studying. And it can involve any type of theoretical analysis. You can do full or partial chord analysis, whether you're using Roman numerals, lead sheet symbols, or anything in between. I personally, when I was learning the Bach's Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue, had a really hard time remembering all the different chords in the fantasy, and I ended up just doing a lead sheet analysis, and that really helped solidify my learning. One that I find particularly useful with my students is a phrase analysis. So we go through, where does each phrase begin and end? How are they related? Where are the main cadences? And you can you can notate this directly on the score, or you can create your own phrase diagrams if you remember your theory courses. These are questions that can be addressed away from the instrument and clearly help us understand how the music fits together. Another activity is large form analysis. So this is one that I think is more commonly done with our students. I think a lot of teachers ask, is this sonato allegro form, rondo form, minuet and trio, rounded binary, or some sort of combination? The trick with large form analysis, in my experience, is to go the extra step and to ask our students, why is it useful to know that? If there is repeated material, do we want to treat it like signposts and play it similarly? Do we want to vary it to keep things different? Are there any differences between the repeated sections that you can highlight through phrasing or other means? And then what does the composer vary in different sections? These are the sort of types of questions that should stem from understanding the large scale form of the piece. Motivic and thematic analyses is one that I have really embraced, especially in understanding much of the difficult and complex contemporary music that I love to perform. We all know the importance of knowing where the theme is, but how many of us have students who can tell us where the main theme is, but actually fail to do anything useful with that information? Simply knowing the theme is probably insufficient. And so this next category doves explores this idea. So we have thematic. Once the student knows the thematic material, it can open up new activities you can have them do away from the instrument. So I have one student that likes to compose, and I eventually realized I can use this to help him both internalize themes from the music we're learning and develop a better understanding of the compositional techniques used to develop these thematic materials. So basically, we just took some themes from the music, and I asked him to compose his own music using those themes. So I admit he does this partially at the piano, but I count it as score studying as it does incorporate a lot of planning away from the instrument. A simpler idea is to have students sing the different themes and motives. Leon Fleischer is a big proponent of having all his students sing through their music with intent, including dynamics and articulation. This really helps to internalize the music. I always say to my students that they should never play faster than they can think. And if they can sing the music, I know that that means they can think it. This also has the added benefit of helping to develop their audiation skills and solidifying their oral memory. And then you can also have students simply write down the different themes and motives to note each reappearance and to notice what is different with each reoccurrence. So I use a worksheet to help organize all this, and I'll go through that at the end of the presentation. Historical score studying is probably one of the simplest to do, especially with the resources available today. So something like Wikipedia alone contains a vast amount of information. And this is not even counting databases like Realm or JSTOR or Grove Dictionary Online. And these things, even if you're not associated with the university, can often be accessed through a public library. And I have found students, especially my younger ones, are particularly reticent to read about their music. You, as a teacher, have to work hard to help to understand the value. And I often do this type of score study in the lesson to help with this. You have to work. You have to work hard, and it becomes easier as students age and becomes accustomed to doing their own research. Reading about composers and music of the past can greatly help with your interpretation and ornamentation. For example, a crescendo does not always just mean to get louder. Often, some composers in the Romantic era used them to indicate rubato, and this is something that eventually may have fallen out of practice, but it's important to understand as you're interpreting your music. Different technical limitations of past instruments might also change how you want to look at the music. So I'm a pianist, so I look at a keyboard piece written for organ, and that means I need to understand it differently than, say, another Baroque piece that was written for harpsichord. Why did a composer write this piece? Some pieces we know were directly inspired by historical events, some were inspired by personal friends, and some, such as Beethoven's Opus 31 sonatas, were written because he was just late on his rent and threatened with eviction if he couldn't pay it, so he needed to hurry up and get those sonatas finished already. And then, is there anything a composer's character and personality can tell us about the music? Is Debussy's personality shown? Does it make it different than Ravel? These are questions worth exploring. And lastly, many pieces are directly inspired by poetry, folktale, and other extra musical and programmatic influences. So without this understanding, it seems to me that it would be impossible to properly interpret a music work, let alone actually understand it enough to make it your own. Can you imagine playing Maurice Ravel's Mother Goose Suite without knowing the fairy tales, or performing in an orchestra with the Cinderella Suite without knowing anything about Cinderella? So these things might sound simple, but we still need to help direct our students to understand why they would want to do this kind of stuff away from the instrument. Now, if you're looking for activities more creative and less analytical, there's still lots of great options for you. So, one that I'm sure many of us already do is to create your own story to go with the music. I have found this is especially effective with my younger students, but there's no reason it won't work for advanced students. This is, I think, a terrific activity because in order to come up with a story that truly fits a piece, students need to understand a myriad of different things, including the many musical gestures and form. They need to think about the personal effect the music has. And I have also found that this increases their own personal attachment to the music. And you can even structure the story in such a way to help students understand the form of a piece. So, as an example, many a good fairy tales have repeating sections. So, if you think of Goldilocks, she does everything in threes, and then there's three main things she does: she eats, she sits, and she sleeps. And so, you can structure your stories in such a way that they reflect the repetitions of the music. If you want something more grounded, you can work with students to come up with a story that draws from specific events in a composer's life. So if you're playing something by Beethoven, what kind of events can connect to the music? My personal favorite, and I probably overuse this with my students, is an anecdote where he was listening to a piano virtuoso play one of his own sonatas in concert. And Beethoven was so enraged by his performance that he kicked the other pianist off the keyboard and finished the performance because of how unhappy he was with it. And really, like stories like that, what's more emblematic of his personality? What better way to help us understand his music? And you can even apply any programmatic material directly to the piece. So for many songs, right, this association is already taken care of through effects such as word painting, and some pieces, including several works by Franz Liszt, just incorporate the poetry directly into the score. But for those programmatic pieces without such a clear diagram, I have found it very effective to go through and choose exactly where different aspects or different events of the programmatic background occur. Lastly, score studying is an incredible tool to aid in memorization. There are many different activities you can do to aid with memory, and all of them will reveal just how much we all secretly rely on muscle memory. So I challenge you to try some of these yourself, and I think you'll be surprised at how difficult some of them are. So the first thing to try is to write down your score by memory. I often try to do this myself with checkpoints. So if I can write down different checkpoints I have in a piece of music, I know that I know them. And this includes not just the notes. This is every musical gesture, tempo marking, articulation, anything that's on the score I need to write down. It's way more difficult than you might think. You can do the same for melodies out of context, or even more difficult is to try and write down different accompaniments for different sections. And this is a terrific way to target problem spots. I would not have you guys write down the whole piece of music from memory. That's sort of an exercise in excess. But rather, this is a good way to focus on any section that is giving you particularly difficulty. You can also try singing the different musical voices, both melodic and accompanimental. And I've personally found this very helpful for collaborative and chamber music. So if you're a pianist, can you sing the instrumental or vocal solo part? And if you are the instrumentalist or vocalist, can you sing and audiate what the piano part does or what the other instruments you're playing with do? You can also try and recreate a diagram of a piece from memory. You can do this with any type of diagram, dynamic phrase structure, large scale form, etc. I myself found this very useful when I once needed to learn a very large rondo form piece far too quickly. And by diagramming the form by memory, and then I notated with my checkpoints where in the repeated sections things were different, it made learning that piece much easier. And in one of the more recent issues of American Music Teacher, Frederick Chu also had a great idea to help solidify your memory away from the instrument. So he called it his conference call exercise. And essentially, you create several checkpoints across the piece and then cut up a copy of the score following those checkpoints. And then you challenge the student to put them back into order. And you can see how this exercise can be helpful for helping a student memorize a piece, especially longer works or works with lots of repeated sections. It is even more effective, I think, if you can use a different edition of the piece so the student is not relying on non musical visual cues to help put the work together. One of the biggest hurdles for effective score studying is how you can possibly include it into the lesson with everything else we're trying to include in the lessons. So in this next bit, I'm going to discuss some of the ideas that I have found effective, as well as go through some worksheets that you can adapt and modify to fit your own teaching. So just like with our regular teaching, you need to be specific. Asking a student to score study, if you just say, do this score studying, right, you're going to overwhelm them or confuse them. And most likely what will happen is nothing. So, by directing a student to complete an activity with a specific due date and goal, that will be much more effective than just telling them to score study their music. For younger students, especially, I find it's essential that the parents are involved or at least aware. Parents may think that their child is just slacking off or wasting time if they're sitting there practicing without actually making a sound. And so you need to make sure parents are aware that you've asked them to do this score studying. And this is also tied into the specific assignments. Parents are very used to students doing schoolwork and are very, often very helpful when it comes to homework. And they can treat score studying with their children in a very similar fashion. Just like learning literally anything else, it takes practice to score study effectively. You need to practice the score studying in the lesson to make sure they know what to do at home. And then consistency is important. A student who scores studies once a month will not gain very much from that effort. I use weekly, sometimes bi weekly, assignments to keep students score studied on a regular schedule. And then many of the activities we have discussed work for all stages of learning a piece. And this is helpful because then I can design activities that fit where my students' progress is. So I've created several different worksheets that I use for my own teaching, and I just modify them as necessary. They're all found in the handout, and I'm happy to send out editable files as well to anyone who is interested. So this first worksheet is basically a template when a student is beginning a new piece of music. It asks the student to look over the whole score and make note of anything that is new. So vocabulary, dynamic markings, articulation, rhythms, notes, anything like that. And to label any sections that they just think by looking at them might need extra work. This allows the student to quickly ascertain anything that needs to be looked up and serves as a handy dandy reference while they're actually learning the piece. So this second worksheet is one I have all my college age students complete when they're beginning a new piece. This one's focused more on historical context and form, and also asks the students to listen to other works by their composer. And I find this is especially important to help them put things into context. The first time we use this worksheet, I spend a fair bit of time in the lesson going over the different resources they can use to answer the questions, including both online and library resources. This third worksheet serves as a thematic resource. So it asks our students to identify and copy down the different themes and to identify both their character and where else the themes appear in the composition. So I found this especially helpful for dense compositions such as fugues and other contrapunto works, as well as contemporary music, where the thematic material is not always as obvious. And this final worksheet serves as a simple template for formal analysis. It further asks students how understanding the form can help shape their interpretation. This final question is the important one, as everything in score studying should be helping a student towards their musical understanding and ultimately their performance and love of that work. And I like using these worksheets as they can be kept with each piece of music. So usually my students keep a binder with these next to them, and then they can use these as reference throughout the whole learning process. Thanks very much for watching. And I hope that while I believe we all think score studying is important, that I have convinced you to start incorporating it even more into your studio and have given you a few ideas of how the many different activities can be worked in. So the handout for this presentation, I believe MTNA is providing it, as well as is on my website, and which I've linked for you here, or you can scan that QR code and that should take you right to the handout as well. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions or would like editable versions of the handouts, and I hope you enjoy the rest of our virtual conference.